Vivian Carter never looked like a billionaire, and that was exactly how she preferred it. At 38 years old, she lived quietly in a modest brownstone in Boston's historic Back Bay neighborhood. She drove an aging Volvo, favored department store sales over designer boutiques, and spent her weekends at cozy local coffee shops rather than upscale restaurants. If you passed her on the street, you might have thought she was a schoolteacher, maybe a librarian, someone warm, intelligent, and kind, but certainly not someone with a financial empire at her fingertips. But behind her unassuming appearance, Vivian Carter was the co-founder and CEO of Health Tech Solutions, a groundbreaking company that had revolutionized patient care across America. Her innovative health software helped hospitals manage patient data more efficiently, dramatically improving treatment outcomes. Thanks to her vision, survival rates for diseases like leukemia had risen significantly over the past decade. Yet, despite her success, Vivian remained largely unknown to the public. She preferred to stay behind the scenes, allowing her business partner, David Grant, to handle media appearances and the spotlight. "You're the face, I'm the workhorse," she often joked, and that arrangement suited her just fine. Vivian's deep commitment to her work wasn't just about ambition or profits, it was personal. 20 years ago, she had watched helplessly as her younger brother, Michael, battled leukemia. Despite their parents' hard work, the medical bills devastated the family, wiping out their savings and ultimately costing them their home. Vivian carried the memory of that hardship in everything she did. It fueled her drive to create affordable healthcare solutions and informed her quiet but consistent philanthropic efforts. Unlike many wealthy individuals, Vivian didn't believe in grand gestures or flashy donations. She gave millions anonymously each year to causes she personally vetted: cancer research, children's hospitals, education initiatives for underprivileged youth. She refused to have her name etched onto buildings or her face splashed across charity galas. For Vivian, true generosity wasn't about recognition, it was about results. Her modesty extended to every corner of her life. Vivian still wore the same cream-colored dress she had bought for David's wedding 3 years earlier. Her jewelry consisted of a single pair of pearl earrings, a gift from her late mother. She didn't see the point in upgrading her car, her wardrobe, or her home simply because she could. To her, value was found in action, not appearances. As Vivian sat in her sunlit office one Tuesday afternoon, reviewing a stack of proposals for charitable donations, she thought briefly about Michael. He would have been 32 this year. That thought often surfaced around his birthday, bringing a bittersweet ache to her heart. She set aside a proposal for the Peterson Children's Cancer Gala. The event was designed to fund a new research wing for pediatric cancer treatment, exactly the kind of project that would have mattered to her brother. Though Vivian usually avoided society events, this time, she found herself hesitating. Maybe it was time to step into the world she so often avoided, not for herself, but for children like Michael, and the families still fighting battles they shouldn't have to face alone. Vivian Carter had never been one for glittering ballrooms or lavish galas. The very idea of small talk over champagne flutes and designer gowns made her skin crawl. But this time, the cause was different, it was personal. After reviewing the invitation for the Peterson Children's Cancer Gala one more time, Vivian knew she couldn't turn away. This event wasn't about status or appearances, it was about giving hope to families still fighting battles she understood all too well. The evening of the gala, Vivian stood in front of her modest closet, considering her options. True to form, she selected the same cream-colored dress she had worn 3 years ago to her business partner's wedding. It was simple yet tasteful, with a modest neckline and delicate buttons down the front. She slipped on her only pair of pearl earrings, styled her hair into loose waves, and applied a touch of mascara and lipstick. No stylist. No flashy accessories. No designer handbag, just a plain leather clutch she had owned for years. When the black sedan arrived, sent by Daniel Foster, the former employee who had invited her, Vivian hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. As the car weaved through Boston's early evening traffic, a wave of nervous energy coursed through her. In her everyday life, Vivian moved invisibly through the world, her fortune hidden behind simple clothes and an unassuming smile. Tonight, however, she would be stepping into a space where wealth and status were worn like armor. The Four Seasons Hotel glowed under the city lights as the sedan pulled up to the entrance. Vivian took a deep breath, thanked the driver, and made her way inside. The lobby, decorated with towering floral arrangements and shimmering chandeliers, buzzed with the low hum of laughter and conversation. She checked in at the registration table, where the young woman managing the guest list gave her a polite but slightly puzzled smile after glancing at her plain attire. "Table 16, Ms. Carter," the woman said, subtly gesturing toward the back of the grand ballroom. Vivian nodded and made her way inside. As she walked past glittering tables adorned with crystal centerpieces and gold-plated silverware, she couldn't help but notice the glances, some curious, others openly judgmental. It was clear that in this room, appearances mattered far more than intentions. Daniel spotted her almost immediately and made his way through the crowd, offering a warm smile. Dressed in a classic tuxedo, he looked every bit the part, yet there was genuine happiness in his eyes when he saw her. "You made it," he said, offering his arm in a friendly gesture. "I said I would," Vivian replied, grateful for a familiar face amidst a sea of strangers. As they approached table 16, Daniel leaned closer. "I seated you toward the back like you asked. No introductions, no big fuss. You're just my old friend who works in tech." Vivian smiled. That was exactly how she wanted it. Tonight wasn't about her. It was about the children, and the promise of a future where fewer families had to face the devastating losses she knew all too well. As Vivian Carter settled into her seat at table 16, the contrast between her and the rest of the guests became glaringly obvious. Around her, the women shimmered in designer gowns sewn with crystals, their necks heavy with diamonds and their wrists flashing gold. The men wore custom-tailored tuxedos, their shoes gleaming under the soft light of the chandeliers. Everywhere she looked, there were polished smiles and the easy arrogance of old money. At her table, 3 couples were already deep in conversation, their laughter light and knowing. When Daniel introduced her, simply as a friend from the tech industry, their polite nods barely masked their curiosity and judgment. Victoria Whitaker, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes, offered a thin smile before turning back to her husband, Henry, and whispering something that made him chuckle behind his hand. Vivian could feel it, the subtle but unmistakable air of dismissal. It wasn't new to her. She had spent years as a young black woman in the tech world being underestimated, overlooked, and undervalued. But here, in this ornate ballroom, the judgment was more superficial, almost cruel in its swiftness. Her cream dress, though perfectly appropriate by any reasonable standard, looked plain among the sea of designer couture. Her simple pearl earrings were dwarfed by the heavy gems worn by the women around her. Midway through the salad course, the unspoken disdain became more obvious. The Prestons spoke loudly about their daughter's acceptance into Harvard, legacy, of course, and never once made eye contact with Vivian. When Nancy Caldwell asked, almost absently, where Vivian had attended college, Vivian answered simply, "I didn't finish college." The reaction around the table was palpable. Victoria's perfectly plucked eyebrows arched in surprise. Margaret Preston gave a tight, polite smile, and Charles Preston cleared his throat awkwardly. It was as if Vivian had confessed to a crime rather than merely sharing a fact. Well, self-taught individuals do have a certain determination," Charles said, his tone dripping with condescension. Vivian smiled quietly and sipped her water, refusing to rise to the bait. She had nothing to prove to people who measured worth by degrees, jewelry, or brand names. Later, during a quiet moment, a server approached her table, visibly uncomfortable. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, glancing nervously at his notes, "but could you verify you're at the correct table?" Across the table, Victoria Whitaker smirked into her champagne glass. The implication was clear: surely someone dressed so simply couldn't belong at a table reserved for significant donors. Vivian calmly retrieved her embossed invitation card and handed it to the server. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said, her voice even but firm. The server quickly apologized and retreated, but the damage was already done. Around her, a heavy, awkward silence fell. Vivian felt the familiar sting of being judged not for her character or her accomplishments, but for her appearance. Yet she sat tall, composed, and unbothered. She reminded herself why she had come tonight: for the children, not for the approval of a society that measured human worth by surface and spectacle. As the dinner plates were cleared and soft music filled the grand ballroom, Vivian Carter sat quietly at table 16, feeling increasingly invisible. Conversations buzzed all around her, topics ranging from ski trips in Aspen to yacht renovations in Martha's Vineyard. None of it included her. She was used to this kind of exclusion, but tonight, in such a glittering, performative setting, it felt particularly stark. Across the room, a photographer was making his rounds, capturing images of the event's major donors and society darlings. As he approached their table, Vivian noticed him hesitate. His camera lowered slightly, and after a brief glance at her plain dress and modest pearl earrings, he turned away without taking a picture. It was a small gesture, but it carried a heavy message: "You're not important enough." Then came the moment that crystallized the night's quiet slights into open mockery. A woman at the neighboring table, clad in a vibrant red gown and dripping with jewels, leaned toward her group and, in a voice just loud enough to carry, asked, "Who invited her?" She nodded toward Vivian with a smirk. Her companions followed her gaze and laughed openly. One of the men, a broad-shouldered executive type with a Rolex flashing on his wrist, added, "Probably someone's housekeeper who got confused about the event schedule." Ripples of laughter spread, subtle but cutting. Heads turned. Eyes darted toward Vivian. Some guests whispered behind hands, others simply stared, amusement flickering in their eyes. It was clear they thought she didn't belong. Vivian sat perfectly still, her spine straight, her expression calm. But inside, a familiar ache gnawed at her, the old, painful knowledge that no matter what she had achieved, to some people, she would always be judged first by what she looked like rather than who she was. Daniel Foster, standing a few tables away, caught sight of the commotion. His face darkened, and he immediately started moving toward her. But before he could reach her, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone at the front of the room, calling for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC's voice rang out, "please join me as we begin the pledge drive for the Peterson Children's Cancer Research Wing." The laughter subsided, though Vivian could still feel the lingering stares. As the lights dimmed and a promotional video began to play across giant screens, Vivian folded her hands in her lap, grounding herself in the reason she had come. The video showed images of children bravely fighting cancer, tiny hands gripping 4 poles, mothers wiping away tears, doctors explaining treatment plans with hopeful smiles. Vivian felt a lump rise in her throat. "This," she reminded herself firmly, "is why I'm here. Not for them. Not for their approval. For the children. For Michael. For every family that needed hope." She inhaled deeply, straightened her shoulders, and prepared herself for what was to come. Tonight was far from over, and the real impact she would make was just beginning. As the final notes of the promotional video faded, the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone, his voice charged with emotion. Tonight, our goal is to raise $5 million to begin construction on the Peterson Children's Cancer Research Wing. Every pledge, large or small, brings us closer to saving more young lives. Hands began to rise across the ballroom. Generous pledges echoed through the room: $10,000, $25,000, $50,000. Each time a new donation was announced, polite applause followed, with the larger gifts drawing approving nods and congratulatory glances. At table 16, the Prestons pledged $75,000, and the Whitakers chimed in with a $50,000 donation. Nancy Caldwell offered $100,000, earning a small ripple of admiration. Victoria Whitaker turned to Vivian with a saccharine smile. "And you, dear? Perhaps you could manage $100? Every bit helps." The condescension in her voice was thick, drawing soft chuckles from around the table. Vivian met Victoria's gaze evenly, her heart pounding, but not with anger. Rather, it was a sense of clarity, a quiet decision crystallizing inside her. She picked up the pledge card in front of her and studied it for a moment, thinking not about the room, not about the smug faces around her, but about the children she had seen in the video. Children like her brother Michael, children who deserved better. Without fanfare, Vivian raised her hand. The MC, standing at the front of the room, caught sight of her and smiled warmly. "Yes, the lady at table 16. Thank you. What amount would you like to pledge?" Vivian rose to her feet, her posture relaxed yet commanding. $10 million, she said clearly, her voice steady enough to carry across the entire ballroom. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Forks clattered against plates. Murmurs swept through the crowd like a wave. At table 16, champagne glasses halted midair. Victoria Whitaker's jaw dropped, her eyes wide with disbelief. The MC blinked, clearly caught off guard. I'm sorry, ma'am. Did you say $10 million? Vivian nodded, offering a small, composed smile. Yes. That should cover the construction costs, and provide enough funding to operate the research wing through its first year. An audible gasp rippled through the ballroom. Daniel Foster, standing nearby, beamed with pride. He wasn't surprised, he had always known the quiet power Vivian Carter possessed. From the VIP tables up front, a man stood abruptly, pointing. "Wait, is that Vivian Carter? The founder of Health Tech Solutions?" Heads turned sharply. A buzz of recognition filled the room as guests hurriedly pulled out their phones, whispering and exchanging wide-eyed glances. Within seconds, Vivian's identity, the unassuming woman they had mocked, was no longer a mystery. She wasn't just a guest. She was a pioneer in healthcare innovation, a billionaire philanthropist whose technology had already saved countless lives. The shift in atmosphere was palpable. Those who had laughed now looked stricken with embarrassment. Those who had ignored her now scrambled for ways to offer belated smiles and handshakes. But Vivian remained still, calm, and quietly dignified, standing not for applause, but for something far greater, a cause that mattered beyond image, wealth, or social approval. The buzz in the ballroom grew louder with each passing second, like a rising tide swallowing up the polite, controlled atmosphere. Whispers rippled from table to table as Vivian Carter's name sank in. Many guests pulled out their phones discreetly under the tablecloths, hurriedly searching her name, confirming the impossible. Vivian Carter, the quiet woman in the simple cream dress, was not only a billionaire, but the visionary CEO who had transformed healthcare technology across the country. Her innovations had streamlined patient care, improved survival rates, and made a real difference in countless lives. Suddenly, the photographers who had previously overlooked her were jockeying for position, angling for the best shot. Waiters who had earlier glanced past her now paused and bowed slightly when passing her table. Even guests from the prestigious front tables craned their necks to catch a glimpse of her. At table 16, the reactions were almost comical. Victoria Whitaker fumbled with her napkin, her cheeks flushed a deep, embarrassed red. Henry Whitaker coughed awkwardly into his hand. Margaret and Charles Preston whispered furiously to each other, their smiles frozen in place. Nancy Caldwell simply stared at her plate, unable to meet Vivian's eyes. Victoria was the first to recover, barely. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair in the process, and hurried over to Vivian. Her voice was syrupy sweet, dripping with false warmth. "Vivian, dear, I had no idea," she gushed. "If we had only known." Vivian turned to her calmly, her expression unreadable. "If you had known, you would have treated me differently," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight far heavier than volume. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it?" Victoria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Around them, the awkwardness was almost tangible. Guests who had previously laughed at Vivian now scrambled to reposition themselves, to offer congratulations, compliments, business cards, anything to repair the damage their earlier judgment had caused. But Vivian was not interested in salvaging their approval. She politely shook hands when necessary but offered no false smiles, no false forgiveness. Instead, she engaged in earnest conversation with Dr. Eleanor Chen, the modest pediatric oncologist responsible for the research program Vivian's donation would fund. Their discussion was passionate and focused, about treatment protocols, research strategies, and the real-world impact the new cancer wing would have. Vivian's eyes lit up as she spoke, her passion for the cause shining brighter than any diamond in the room. Daniel Foster stood nearby, a proud smile on his face. He had known who Vivian was all along, of course. He had respected her wish for anonymity, knowing that she preferred substance over spectacle. By the time the MC announced, with genuine emotion, that thanks to Vivian Carter's extraordinary generosity they had exceeded their fundraising goal, the entire ballroom rose in a standing ovation. But Vivian knew the applause wasn't truly for her, it was for the children who would have a better chance at life because of what they had accomplished together. And that, she thought, was all that really mattered. As the applause faded and the evening began to wind down, Vivian Carter found herself once again standing apart from the crowd, not because she was excluded, but because she chose it. She had no interest in the flood of sudden admirers now eager to shake her hand, offer business cards, or pose for photographs. Instead, she spent her time speaking with Dr. Eleanor Chen, listening intently to the doctor's vision for the new cancer research wing. They discussed how the facility would not only advance treatment protocols but also provide comfort and hope to families during their darkest times. For Vivian, those conversations mattered far more than any hollow praise being tossed around the room. Near the end of the evening, the master of ceremonies approached Vivian with a request. "Miss Carter, would you be willing to say a few words before we conclude?" For a moment, Vivian hesitated. Public speaking had never been her favorite thing. But tonight wasn't about comfort, it was about principle. She gave a small nod and stepped up to the microphone. The ballroom quieted almost instantly. Vivian looked out across the sea of faces, faces that had once judged her, then revered her, all without knowing a single thing about her character. She took a breath and spoke with a calm, steady voice. "My brother Michael died of leukemia when he was just 12 years old," she began. Her words were simple, unembellished, but they carried the full weight of her loss. "I know what it feels like to watch someone you love fight a battle they can't win, not because they didn't fight hard enough, but because better treatments didn't exist yet." A hush fell over the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others leaned forward, drawn in by the authenticity of her words. "Tonight is not about me," Vivian continued. "It's not about who has the finest clothes or the biggest bank account. It's about the children and families who deserve a fighting chance. It's about remembering that true worth isn't measured by appearances, by jewelry, or by the labels on our backs. It's measured by compassion, by actions, and by the way we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer us." She paused, letting the message sink in. "Sometimes," she said finally, "the person you least expect is carrying the heaviest burden, or the greatest gift. Judge less. Care more." With that, Vivian stepped away from the microphone. She didn't wait for applause. She simply offered a respectful nod to the audience, thanked Dr. Chen one more time, and made her way quietly toward the exit. Behind her, the ballroom sat in reflective silence before slowly erupting into a second, more genuine round of applause, this time not for the billionaire, but for the woman, for the message, and for the reminder that every human being deserves dignity and respect. Vivian Carter left that night the same way she had entered, humble, purposeful, and true to herself. But the people she left behind would never see the world, or one another, quite the same way again. Vivian Carter stepped out into the crisp Boston night, leaving the bright lights and murmured conversations of the ballroom behind her. The cool air wrapped around her like an old friend, steadying her after the whirlwind of the evening. She paused on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing in deeply, savoring the simple freedom of the open sky above. Her car service pulled up quietly. As the driver opened the door for her, Vivian glanced back at the Grand Hotel. Through the windows, she could still see the glittering figures inside, some laughing, some deep in thought, others busy tapping messages on their phones, no doubt sharing the story of the night when a simple woman in a cream dress had turned their world upside down. Vivian smiled softly to herself. She hadn't set out to teach anyone a lesson, but sometimes life had its own way of revealing truths. Tonight wasn't about revenge or proving herself. It had been about standing firm in her values, about honoring Michael's memory, and about shining a light on what truly mattered: kindness, humility, and genuine compassion. As the car pulled away from the curb, Vivian's thoughts drifted to her parents, hard-working people who had sacrificed so much yet still faced hardship beyond their control. They had taught her early on that dignity wasn't tied to wealth or education or social standing. It lived in the way you treated others, especially when you thought no one was watching. Inside the gala, the atmosphere had shifted. Those who had mocked now sat with a weight of quiet shame, others whispered about how easily they had been fooled by appearances. Some would surely move on and forget, brushing aside the evening as an anomaly. But Vivian knew a few would carry the night's lesson with them, tucked away in a quiet corner of their hearts. And that was enough. Daniel Foster sent her a text as she rode home. "Thank you for being exactly who you are." Vivian responded simply, "Always." At home, she climbed the familiar steps to her brownstone, her worn shoes tapping against the old stone. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She placed her clutch on the kitchen counter, kicked off her heels, and slipped into her favorite cardigan. It was just another night now, in the life she had carefully, intentionally built. The world might have finally seen the woman behind the plain dress, but Vivian Carter remained unchanged. Her values, her purpose, her quiet strength, all remained intact, rooted deeply in something money and recognition could never touch. In a society obsessed with surface and spectacle, Vivian's actions served as a gentle but powerful reminder: true greatness doesn't announce itself with trumpets and spotlights. It walks softly, speaks kindly, and leaves a lasting imprint on the souls it touches. And somewhere tonight, a child fighting cancer, a grieving parent, or a struggling family would have a better tomorrow, because one woman refused to let the world's shallow judgments change who she was. Vivian Carter's story reminds us that true worth is never found in appearances, wealth, or social status. It lives in our character, our compassion, and how we treat others, especially when we believe they have nothing to offer us. In a world that often celebrates surface over substance, Vivian showed the quiet power of dignity, humility, and steadfast values. For those of us in the later chapters of life, this lesson is especially meaningful. We have witnessed trends rise and fall, fortunes built and lost. What endures is not the size of our bank accounts or the brands we wear, but the kindness we extend, the integrity we uphold, and the lives we touch along the way. Vivian's example reminds us that even small, consistent acts of respect and generosity can leave an imprint deeper than any public accolade. True greatness is not loud, it is patient, steady, and often unseen by the crowd. And when the world misjudges us, as it surely will, our best response is not anger or revenge, but the quiet dignity of living true to who we are.